Now, this video is definitely going to be the most opinionated video in this section, and that's because I'm going to be talking about React folder structures. I'm not saying that any one of these folder structures are better or worse than the others. I'm just presenting you with a bunch of different options for how you can lay out and structure your folders inside of React, because they really don't give you an opinion on how you should do this. They leave it entirely up to you, which can be quite overwhelming, especially as your project starts to grow. So this very first folder structure I want to look at is essentially like the beginner folder structure. If you're working on a very small project, you're just getting started on a project, this folder structure is going to work perfectly fine for you. And essentially it is no structure at all. I mean, there's a little bit of structure because you have a folder for some of your more global hooks, and you have a folder for some of the different components you're using. But as you'll notice, this is kind of unwieldy and gets quite large. As you can see, we have a bunch of different files inside of here, things like some helper functions for formatting different things, as well as our CSS. We have things inside of here for doing context, and in our components, we just have all of our components with no structure at all. Now, on a small project where you maybe only have like 10, 15 different components, and it's all on like one, maybe two pages, this is a perfectly fine structure for you. But obviously, as your project starts to grow beyond a really basic project, you're going to outgrow this structure incredibly soon. Now, this next structure I want to talk about is a bit of a more intermediate structure, and I think this is pretty much the sweet spot for most medium to even larger sized projects because it allows you to break down everything you're working on into small sections while still making the code relatively easy to understand and use. You'll notice inside of our source folder here, the only files that we have in this section is really just like our app file, and that's about it, nothing else really inside this section. And then we have a folder for everything else we're trying to do. So our assets folder is going to contain global things like different CSS and logos and images that you need to use throughout your application. Then we have the components folder. This is going to also be broken down into subfolders. So based on how your components are used, so like if you have a bunch of like buttons and button groups dropdowns, those are like UI based components. So we have a UI folder in them. Everything related to forms is in this form folder. And then we have some other stuff like the nav bar that doesn't really fit into any of those other folders. But generally we try to folderize all of our different components to make it a little bit easier to work with them because they are, compartmentalized. Also, we have all of our different tests inside of this test folder. You can put your tests inside a test folder or put them right next to the component. It's really entirely up to you. I just showed one way of doing it here. Then we have a folder for all of our different context, and these are mostly going to be all the context used throughout our entire application, especially like global context that are going to be used all over the place, like an auth context. Finally, we come to a data section. This is for handling things like constant values, type files if you're in TypeScript, some JSON, pretty much anything that is data related or is a constant value, things that don't change at all. After that, we come to a hooks folder, which again is mostly for storing those global hooks that you're going to be using all across your entire application. I'm going to skip this pages folder real quick, go down to utils because this is just those utility libraries. They're usually really small pieces of code. Most often they're pure functions. They just do one really simple thing, but they're generally used everywhere in your application. Finally, we come down to this pages folder, and the pages folder is broken up even further into individual folders for each of the pages we have. So for example, you can see our home page has all of this stuff for relating to to-dos. We have our index.js, which is just the actual file that renders our home. And then we have all these other components that are part of our home itself. Same with our login, we have that index.js and then all the components as well as a hook here. You can see we have this use login hook because it's only useful in this login page, so we put it inside the login page. Same thing with our settings, we have a settings context and a use settings hook. All of those are only useful for our settings, so we put it in the same folder as our settings page. And then finally, the sign up section is essentially the exact same thing. Another important thing to note is that if, for example, in my home here, in my new to-do modal or in my to-do form, I have another component that I want to break out that's only used in that one single file, it makes sense just to have both those components in the same file. Same thing with custom hooks or context. If they're only ever used in one single file, it just makes sense to put all those things in one file until they become too large and you need to break them out, or if you need to share them across different components in different files. This is something I've done multiple times in this course. For example, in the Google Calendar clone, all the stuff related to my calendar was all in one file. Even though I had like 5 different components in there, they were all used in one place, so I just put them all in one file. Now, this is a really great project structure because it allows you to break up all your different things that you're going to be using inside your application into different folders. And it's really nice having this pages folder because it allows you to put all the components that are only useful on one page into, for example, the home page or the login page or the settings page, which again breaks down things a little bit further. So all of these main source folders are mostly for like things that are used globally across your entire application, while the pages folder is more useful for things that are used on just one single page. The one downside to this folder system though is as your application starts to grow, you may notice that, my user settings are now being displayed in multiple places in my application. So I need this setting information on the home page, or I need it on the sign up page, whereas before I did not need these things there. They were their own independent thing. So as you start to get to that point where different features and different parts of your application are displayed across many different pages, it can become difficult because now you essentially just need to move everything up into these global folders, which is not ideal. When you get to that point, moving to a more advanced folder structure that focuses more on features and less on pages is going to be the route you want to go. So here I have what I would consider a bit more of an advanced folder structure inside of React. You'll notice things are nearly identical to what they were before. We have the assets folder, same thing. We have this components folder, same exact thing. Context, again, same thing. Data, same thing. I'm going to skip features for a second because we have hooks, which are exactly the same thing. Our layouts folder here is just for containing things that are used across multiple sections of our application, like a nav bar or a sidebar, like a container for our main page. Just things that are used pretty much everywhere that are mostly layout based. They're different from components in that components are like one-off things like a checkbox or an input, while a layout is like a whole portion of your page. If you look at VS Code, for example, this right side navigation bar that I'm using, that would be like a layout because it's kind of a whole chunk of a layout on our page, while the left code editor side would be maybe another part of a layout. That's kind of how you can think about layouts versus actual components. Our lib folder here is going to be mostly for interacting with external libraries. So for example, if we were going to be using Axios, I don't want to just put Axios code all over my application. Instead, I want to create my own version of Axios essentially that I can wrap around and I can call Axios through that. And that way, if for some reason I want to swap Axios out for fetch, I can do it in that one single file as opposed to having to do it everywhere across my entire application. As your project gets larger and larger, it's really important that as you start to use third-party libraries, you wrap them in your own code that implements that library for you. That way, if you need to swap out that library, it becomes incredibly easy because you can just swap it out in one single place instead of 100 different files. Now I'm going to skip the pages folder here again. We're going to move down to services. This is purely for handling things like interacting with different APIs, like an analytics API in this case, or maybe if you have an API that gets your data, that's where you're going to put all your API related fetching code. Then inside of utils, that's just like it was before, that's all of our utility functions. Now if we move back up, I skipped over this features section, and that's because features now essentially takes the place of our pages. If I open this up, you'll notice inside of here we have an individual folder for each one of our different features. In our case, our application is built out of authentication, different projects, different settings, and different to-dos. So in this authentication section, you'll now see we have another folder structure. And this folder structure is an exact replica of our overall folder structure. You'll notice we have components, hooks, and services, but we could also, for example, have assets or data or anything else. This contains all of the folders you see here, except for the features folder, because a feature can't really have a feature, because otherwise it would be inside the features folder already. So you essentially have all of the exact same folders, but they're for things that are specific to like authentication. So for example, in our hooks, we have a login, a sign up, and a verify password hook that are specific to just that feature of authentication. Same thing with components, we have forms for logging in and signing up, different services for accessing our information like getting users, logging in, signing up. Those are all services specific to authentication. And then finally, we have an index.js. And all that index.js file does, it's inside of every one of our features, is it just exports all the parts of that feature you want to use throughout the rest of your application. And this is what makes this a really flexible and useful system. And that's because, let's say inside of here, these hooks for use login and use signup, I don't want to use those in my application. Those are only useful inside of like my login form and signup form components. So I don't want to expose those to the rest of my application. So what I would do is I would take all the stuff I want to expose, like a login and a signup form, for example. Maybe those are the only things that I actually want to expose outside of this authentication feature. And in my index.js, I would actually export that login form and that signup form. And then when I need to import something from my authentication feature, I only ever import from the index.js file. Now there are actually ESLint rules you can write that make it so you are not allowed to import from any other folder except for this index.js file. And at the end of this video, I'll show you exactly how you can write that ESLint feature if you want to use a project structure similar to this. So if we go a little further through our features, we can open up projects, for example, and you can see again, it has some services for creating and getting projects as well as some components for rendering those things. And again, in my index.js, I may only want to export some of my things, like maybe just the project list and project form. And those are the only things I actually export from here. Then going a little further, you can see here we have some hooks that we're defining, some context inside of our settings. And here we have some assets for some different images that we're doing inside of our to-dos. And the last section I haven't talked about is this pages section. Really, the only thing about this pages section is you'll notice we have one file for each of our individual pages. And that's because since all of our features are broken down into their own components and folders, our actual pages are relatively straightforward because it's pretty much built up of different layouts that we have, different features that we have, and different components that we have. Everything else about our page is already taken care of in all these sections, so a page is really just sticking together all of those different components together, so it's a relatively simple file, so we don't need a bunch of different folders and stuff to make an individual page, because we already have all of that taken care of everywhere else inside of our project. Now again, as I mentioned, this is not like the only way to do a folder structure in React. There's a million different ways to do it. This is just one way that I like to do it that I've seen different projects do. But again, you can take this, customize it completely. Don't use this at all. Use it exactly as it is. It's entirely up to you. This is very opinionated. This just happens to be one way that I find that works really well for me and works well for other people. But again, tweak it to your own needs or completely scrap it and use something else if you want. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I'll show you exactly how to write an ESLint rule that'll give you these errors that you can see here. So for example, in this project, I just have this features folder, and inside of it, I have two features. I have an other feature and a to-do feature. And inside this to-do feature, I have a component, which is just a to-do component, and I have this local only function. And in my index.js, you'll see I'm only exporting my to-do component. So I'm not exporting this local only function. So essentially, the way that this feature is written, the only publicly accessible thing from this feature is this to-do component. That's the only thing that I want to be allowed to be imported and exported into other parts of my application. That's why it's the only thing I'm exporting here from this function. If I wanted other things to be accessible, like the local only function, I would then add an export line inside of here to do that. So that's right now all I have exported from here. You'll notice when I go into my app, for example, I'm importing my to-do from that index file, and I'm importing this local only, but I'm actually getting a warning here, and it says unexpected path, cannot import anything except the index file within a feature folder. So I'm getting a really good warning message telling me I cannot do this, and it's great because it's built into my editor, built into ESLint, so it's really easy for me to fix. And now I know, hey, you know what, this is local only to that feature. I should not be able to import that anywhere else. Now to write this is relatively straightforward. So we're going to want to go into ESLint, and there's actually a plugin we need to install, and that plugin is called the import plugin. So to install this, we just need to run npm I, and it's called ESLint-plugin-import. Save that as a dev dependency, and that's going to install this import plugin. And then generally, you're going to want to import the recommended settings for it, and it'll just make sure it has all the recommended settings for it. One setting that it does have by default is that you're actually forced when you do an import to add the file extension at the end, otherwise it'll throw an error for you. So that is one thing to keep into account when you're dealing with this that you may not like, and you can disable if you want, or you can just leave it, it really doesn't matter. The important stuff is the custom rule that you can write for fixing the imports that I talked about with the features. So if we go down here, you can see there's a rule for import/no restricted path. And this allows you to actually throw an error or a warning. In my case, I'm making it throw an error based on whenever you try to import something from one file into another file. So here I've set the base path of my import to my source folder, and that's just because I have all my code inside of that source folder. And then you need to define an array of zones. These are essentially all the zones of the places that you want to disallow importing from one place to another. So what this code does is it takes a target. This target is just an array of different locations where you want to look for your imports. So in my case, I'm essentially saying look in any file that is not within my features folder. That this exclamation part features is doing right here. It's just saying look at any file inside of my project that is not in the features folder. So in my case, that is either my app.js or my main.jsx. And if I created more files that weren't in this features folder, those would be captured by this. So I'm checking both of these files to see if I have any imports that are coming in from this file here. So what this line is doing is it's saying, okay, inside my features folder, check to see if I'm importing anything except for the index file, and this line is doing the exact same thing. Now this except line, I actually don't even need, so we can completely ignore this right here. So really all I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, anywhere that's not a feature folder, am I importing something that's not my index file? If so, write out the message right here that says cannot import anything except the index file within a feature folder. Now when I save, you can see when I'm trying to import that local only, that's not within the index file, so it's giving me an error. But here, when I'm trying to import something directly from that index file, it's working. But if I try to import it from the actual file it came from itself, you'll see I'm getting a warning instead, and it's saying I'm trying to import something not in the index file. I need to make sure that I always import from that index file for it to actually not throw an error. So if you do decide to go with this feature-based route, or you decide to do any other route where you want to have like private files inside of a folder and only expose a single public API, this code right here is going to be a really good option for you. And I'm actually going to include this code in the description so you can just copy paste this if you want to.